The call came at 6:47 in the morning, which she would remember later as the exact minute her life split into before and after. Isla had been awake since 5, not because she was excited. She had stopped being excited about things a long time ago, but because the numbers in her head wouldn't settle. She'd been running figures for Hartwell and Associates for 3 years, and she knew, the way you know a crack in a wall before the plaster falls, that something in the Q3 ledger didn't add up. $43,000 scattered across 9 line items, hidden in a way that only someone who understood accounting would recognize as hiding. She'd built the spreadsheet on her kitchen table at 5 a.m. in her apartment in East Vancouver, the kind of building where the hallway smelled like other people's cooking and the heating made sounds like a ship in a storm. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. Then her phone rang. It was Warren Aldgate, her supervisor of 3 years, the man who had shaken her hand at her interview and said, "We value precision here, Isla, and I can already see you have it." Warren, who had never once called her before, ate. "We need you to come in," he said. "No good morning, no preamble. Now, there's been a situation with the books." She felt something shift at the base of her stomach. What kind of situation? A pause, too long. "Come in, Isla." She went in. The boardroom at Hartwell and Associates had a view of False Creek that Isla had always privately thought was wasted on people like Derek Hartwell, who spent meetings staring at his own reflection in the window. He was standing at the head of the table when she walked in, and she noticed 3 things in rapid succession. His lawyer was present, HR was present, and her access badge had already been deactivated at the front door. The receptionist had looked at her with that particular kind of pity that people reserve for accidents they've witnessed, and can't unsee Isla. Derek didn't gesture for her to sit. "We've completed an internal review." She stood very still. She had learned to do that, to make herself a surface that things slid off of, rather than a person things happened to. She'd learned it as a kid in a house where stillness was the only armor available. "There are discrepancies in the accounts you manage," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been documenting them. I was going to bring them to Warren this morning, actually. 43,000 spread across. The discrepancies are the reason we're here." Derek's voice had that particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed this. "We've traced the transfers. They originate from your login credentials." The room went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "That's not possible," Isla said. "The IT report, I don't care what the IT report says, someone used my credentials. That's different from me using them." She looked at Warren because she needed to look at someone who knew her, someone who'd watched her rebuild a client's entire receivable system from scratch after the previous accountant had made a mess of it. Warren looked at the table. That was when she understood. Not all of it, not yet. She would piece the rest together later, sitting in her car in the parking garage, unable to drive, unable to think in anything but fragments. But she understood enough, the discrepancies she'd found. The early morning phone call, the lawyer, the deactivated badge. Someone had been stealing, someone had needed a name to attach to it. And hers had been convenient. "You're being let go," Derek said, effective immediately. "Given the nature of the circumstances, we'll be filing." "You won't," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Because I have copies of everything, and because if you file copies to every regulatory body that oversees this industry, and we will find out very quickly whose login credentials were actually being used and why." She was bluffing about 40% of it. She had some copies, not all of them. But Derek Hartwell was the kind of man who believed that women like Isla, women without connections, without family money, without the right last name, did not push back. The look on his face when she did was almost worth it. Almost. They didn't file, but they also didn't take back the termination. She was escorted to her desk to collect her belongings in a cardboard box, which she carried through the open plan office, while 22 people found reasons to look at their screens. She walked out into the grey November morning with a box containing 1 spare cardigan, a phone charger, a cactus she'd had for 2 years and named Gerald ironically, and the ruined shape of the last 3 years of her life. She sat in her car for 40 minutes. Then she drove to her sister's place in Burnaby, because she didn't know where else to go, and her sister Mina was the closest thing she had to a person who would not ask questions she couldn't answer yet. Mina answered the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt and looked at the cardboard box and looked at Isla's face and said, "Come in. I'll make tea." She did not ask what happened. She made tea and she sat on the other end of the couch and she let Isla be quiet until Isla wasn't quiet anymore. "They set me up," Isla said eventually. "I don't know who did it yet, but they needed a name and I was easy. No connections, no one to call, no one who'd." She stopped. Mina was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." "Do you have savings? 2 months. Maybe 3 if I'm careful." "You can stay here." "I'm not staying here." She said it too fast, too sharp, and she saw Mina flinch. "I'm sorry. I need to figure this out myself. I always figure it out myself." That was both the truest and the saddest thing she'd said all day, and she could tell Mina knew it. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table with the cold coffee and the spreadsheet she'd built at 5 in the morning, the one that had maybe, somehow, triggered all of this, and she did what she always did when things fell apart. She made a list. What she knew, what she could prove, what she needed to find out. The problem was that the third column was very long and the second column was almost empty. She stayed awake until 2 in the morning. When she finally slept, she dreamed about numbers, columns that wouldn't balance no matter what she did, figures that shifted every time she looked away. She spent the next week applying to jobs and being quietly, carefully ignored. She had expected this in the abstract. She had not expected how precisely it would feel like drowning in slow motion. 3 years at Hartwell, a clean record before that, 2 professional certifications and a reputation. She'd had a reputation for being the person you called when something didn't add up, the person who found things, the person who fixed things, and now she was the person associated with a financial discrepancy at a mid-sized firm in Vancouver, and the industry, which was smaller than it looked, had heard some version of a story that was not her story, and doors were closing. She took a shift at a cafe in Kitsilano to cover the gap. She was 31 years old, and she had a CPA designation, and she was making lattes for people who tipped in quarters. She did not allow herself to be bitter about this. She did not have the energy. On a Thursday in December, 2 weeks after she'd been let go, she was walking home from a closing shift when it started to snow. Vancouver snow was not like what people imagined when they thought of Canadian winters. It was wet and half-hearted, the kind that turned to slush before it landed. She stood at the corner of Broadway and Commercial and watched it fall under the streetlights and thought about the $43,000 and whose name she would need to prove it. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. Vancouver area code. She almost didn't answer, but she was cold and tired, and something in her, some part of her that was still looking for the thing that would make the columns balance, made her pick up. "Miss Norwood," said a voice she didn't recognize. Male, low, the kind of voice that didn't raise itself to be heard, because it expected you to listen. "My name is Carver. I understand you have a problem." She stopped walking. "Who is this?" "Someone who has a different problem. I think our problems may be related. That's very cryptic for a Thursday night." A pause, and she thought she heard something on the other end, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Fair. Are you familiar with Hartwell and Associates' contract with Meridian Logistics?" Her whole body went still. She knew that contract. It was one of the 9 line items. "How do you know about that?" she said. "Because Meridian Logistics is one of mine," he said. "And someone has been using it to move money in ways I did not authorize. I've been looking into it for 6 weeks. Your name came up in the course of that investigation. My name came up because someone at Hartwell used my credentials to." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm calling you and not the police." The snow kept falling. A bus went past, sending a spray of grey slush across the sidewalk. Isla stood very still at the corner and thought about the second column of her list, the things she could prove, and how it was still almost empty. "What do you want?" she said. "I want to meet," Carver said. "Tomorrow. I'll send you an address. I don't meet strangers. You're a CPA who got framed for embezzlement and is currently working in a cafe, he said, not unkindly, just accurately. I think your risk calculus may have some room for adjustment. She hated that he was right. Send the address, she said. I'll decide when I see it. The address was a building in Yaletown that had no signage, which she found either very reassuring or very alarming and couldn't decide which. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk staffed by a man who looked at her the way objects look at other objects and said, Ms. Norwood, 42nd floor. The elevator was the kind that didn't have buttons, just a panel that registered your card. She didn't have a card. The security man tapped something on his desk, and the elevator doors opened, and she went up. She had dressed carefully that morning, not to impress. She didn't have clothes for impressing, not the kind that meant anything in a building like this, but to be taken seriously. Dark trousers, a white shirt she'd ironed twice, her good coat, the kind of outfit that said, I am a professional. I am not afraid. She was a little afraid. The 42nd floor was one room and a view of the inlet that made the False Creek view at Hartwell look like a screensaver. The room had a long table, 2 chairs, and a man standing at the window with his back to her. He turned when she came in. She had not let herself form an image of what Carver would look like, because she'd learned that doing that only set you up for being wrong. But she registered things quickly, the way she always did. Tall, broad, somewhere between late 30s and mid-40s, the kind of face that had been handsome before something had happened to it. Not a disfigurement, just a history. The way men who'd been through a great deal wore it differently than men who hadn't. A scar along his jaw that disappeared into the collar of his shirt. Dark suit, no tie. Hands that looked like they'd been used for more things than signing checks. He looked at her the way he might look at a set of numbers that had not yet resolved into a pattern. Miss Norwood, he said. Carver, she said, because she wasn't going to call him sir, and she didn't know his first name, and she wasn't going to ask. He gestured at the chairs. She sat. He sat across from her and folded his hands on the table in the way of a man who was accustomed to waiting and was not inconvenienced by it. I'll be direct, he said. Please, I run a number of businesses. Some of them are legitimate. Some of them exist in a space that requires discretion. He watched her face when he said this. She gave him nothing. Meridian Logistics is one of the legitimate ones. It was being used without my knowledge as a conduit for moving money through Hartwell and Associates client accounts. Approximately $260,000 over 18 months, Isla did the arithmetic without thinking. 43,000 was the portion she'd found. The rest had been elsewhere in the books, obscured differently, in accounts she hadn't managed. Who? She said. That's what I need to determine. I have a name, someone inside Hartwell who had access. But I need someone who understands how the money was moved to confirm it. He paused. I need an accountant. You need an accountant who's currently unemployable and therefore can't refuse. I need an accountant who has a direct professional and legal interest in proving that the money didn't move through her credentials. He didn't say it as a correction. He said it as a clarification, the way you'd correct an equation that was almost right but missing a variable. Isla looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 3 years being careful, being precise, building something, a reputation, a record, a small but stable life out of diligence and accuracy, and in 40 minutes in a boardroom, someone had undone it. Someone had looked at her and seen a name they could use. A person without connections, without family money, without anyone who would make noise if things went wrong. She was tired of being the person without anyone who would make noise. What does this look like? She said. If I say yes, you come in as a contractor, off-book, but protected. I have lawyers and I have leverage, and neither will be used against you. You review the Meridian records and cross-reference them with what you have from Hartwell. You identify the mechanism. You help me find the name I already suspect. He paused again. In exchange, I give you everything you need to file a complaint with CPA Ontario and clear your record. Every document, every log, every trace of how your credentials were accessed and by whom, and then you go back to your life. She thought about her life, the cafe, the 2-month cushion. the spreadsheet on the kitchen table with the empty second column. "I want it in writing," she said. "Everything you just said. I want it drafted by your lawyers, and I want my own lawyer to look at it before I sign anything." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like a recalibration. "You don't have a lawyer," he said. "I'll get one." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She had expected him to push back. She had expected the meeting to go differently, for there to be more maneuvering, more pressure, more of the things that men like this were supposed to do. She didn't know exactly what she'd thought men like Carver did, but she'd expected more of it. Instead, he picked up his phone, said 2 words to someone on the other end, and said, "My legal team will have a draft to you by this evening. Take the time you need." She stood to go. "Mrs. Norwood," he said. She stopped. "Why did you flag it?" he asked. "The 43,000. You could have looked away." She considered this question. It was not the first time someone had asked her a version of it. Her sister had asked something similar. Years ago, when Isla had reported a discrepancy at a different job, and it had cost her a reference. "Because the numbers were wrong," she said, "and I don't know how to leave wrong numbers alone." She left. She found a lawyer, a woman named Fereshte, who had been 3 years ahead of her at UBC, and now ran a small practice in Mount Pleasant that specialized in employment law. Fereshte read the contract in 40 minutes, asked 7 questions, crossed out 2 clauses, and said it was as clean as she'd expected it to be, given who had drafted it. "You know who this is," Isla said. "I know of him," Fereshte said. "He's very careful. Whatever else he is, he's very careful." "That's not reassuring. It's the truth. Go in with your eyes open. Don't let them make you feel like you owe them anything beyond what's on that paper." She paused. "And Isla, document everything. Every conversation. Every file you're given. Every request. You're good at that." She was. She signed the contract. She started the following Monday. The office they gave her was small, which she appreciated. She had never worked well in open plans. It had a desk, a dual monitor setup, and access to the Meridian logistics files going back 3 years. She was not given access to anything else. No one explained the rest of the building to her. She did not ask. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, quietly, without stopping, until she found what she was looking for. On the second day, Carver stopped by her doorway at 7 in the evening, when she was the only person left on that part of the floor. He looked at the screens. She had the transaction logs up in one window and a cross-reference she'd built herself in the other, and said nothing for a moment. "You haven't left," he said. "I have a system," she said, without looking up. "Do you eat?" She had, in fact, not eaten since 11. I was going to. "There's food in the kitchen at the end of the hall," he said. "It's not locked." She looked up then. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and that expression she was starting to recognize. The one that wasn't quite anything, the one that watched. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left. She went to the kitchen. It was stocked in the way of a place where someone had thought about what people needed without making it obvious they'd thought about it. Good coffee, actual food, not just snacks. She made a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter and thought about the pattern in the logs, which was clarifying the way things did when you'd been staring at them long enough. By Wednesday, she had it. Not all of it. There were still threads she needed to follow, but the core of it, the mechanism, the name. She asked Carver's assistant for a meeting. He cleared his afternoon and came to her office. She walked him through it the way she'd been trained to walk clients through complex findings, directly, in sequence, without editorializing. Here is what the data shows. Here is what it means. Here is where it leads. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. "Warren Aldgate," he said. "Primarily, he had an accomplice inside Meridian, someone with access to the logistics invoicing. They built a ghost account within the Meridian Hartwell invoicing system and used it to skim. My credentials were used to obscure the entry point because I was the one who managed the account, and if anything surfaced, I'd be the obvious person to look at." She paused. "I think they expected me not to notice, or not to say anything if I did. Why did they think that?" "Because they thought I needed the job too much to risk it," she said flatly. "They were wrong about the second part." He looked at her for a long moment. "You found all of this in 3 days," he said. "The structure was there. I just had to read it." She hesitated, then said, "There's something else. Tell me, the money, the $260,000, it didn't go to Warren. Not most of it. He was being paid to run it through. Someone else took the bulk." She pulled up the last sheet on her screen. "I can trace it as far as a holding company registered in Alberta. After that it goes offshore, and that's where my access runs out." He looked at the screen. His face had gone very still. "You're sure," he said. "As sure as the data lets me be." He straightened, some way she could name precisely, but she could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather moves in. "This is more than I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "Is it a problem?" "For some people," he said. "Not for us." She noticed the us. She didn't say anything about it. "I'll have my legal team prepare the documentation for your CPA filing," he said. "Everything I promised. You'll have it by end of week. And the Alberta Holding Company? That's mine to deal with," he said. "I know that," she said. "I wasn't asking to be involved. I was asking because I want to know it won't come back to me." He met her eyes. "It won't." She believed him, which surprised her. She was not, as a rule, a person who believed people easily. "Okay," she said. He nodded and moved to leave. "Carver," she said. He stopped in the doorway. She'd been thinking about this for 2 days, whether to say it. "The person at Meridian who helped Warren," she said. "The one with the invoicing access. I think they didn't know who the money was ultimately going to. I think they were told it was one thing and it was another. I'm not saying that excuses it, but you should know before you deal with it, in case it changes what that looks like." He was very still. "You're advocating for someone you've never met," he said. "I'm telling you what the data suggests about their level of culpability," she said. "What you do with it is your business." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she couldn't read. "All right," he said, and left. The documentation arrived Friday morning, as promised. Fereshte reviewed it and declared it complete. Isla filed her response to the CPA complaint that afternoon, with a folder of evidence that was, she privately thought, the most precisely assembled thing she'd ever built. She walked out of Fereshte's office into the December afternoon and stood on the sidewalk on Main Street and felt, for the first time in a month, like she could breathe all the way down. Her phone buzzed. "The Meridian matter has been resolved." "Carver, the individual you mentioned received a different outcome than the others. Thank you for the information." She read it twice. She thought about what different outcome meant in the vocabulary of a man like Carver and decided that in this specific case she was going to accept it at face value. She typed back, "Thank you for keeping your word." A pause. Then, "You expected me not to." She smiled, which was not something her face had done much of lately. "I expected to have to fight for it," she typed. "I was pleasantly surprised." She put her phone in her pocket and started walking toward the SkyTrain. She did not have a job. She had 2 months of savings and a CPA designation and a reputation that was, now, salvageable. She had a list, that same list, the columns on her kitchen table, and the second column was no longer empty. She thought about what came next, the applications she'd send, the conversations she'd have, the careful incremental work of rebuilding something that had been knocked down. Her phone buzzed again. She almost didn't look, but she looked. "I have an opening," Carver had written. "Forensic accounting, legitimate work, due diligence, compliance, tracking irregularities in business interests that require someone who can read a ledger the way you do. The pay is significant. The work is complicated and not always comfortable. You would have full authority over your findings, regardless of what those findings are. Think about it." She stood on the corner of Main and Broadway. The same corner, she realized, where she'd taken his call in the snow 3 weeks ago, and read the message 3 times. Full authority over her findings, regardless of what those findings are. He had included that line deliberately. She knew it. He knew she'd know it. It was his way of saying, "I am not Warren Altgate. I am not Derek Hartwell. I will not ask you to look away." She stood there for a long time, longer than was practical, while the December afternoon went dark around her. She thought about her list, what she knew, what she could prove. what she needed to find out. Then she typed, "I'll need the offer in writing. My lawyer will review it, and I want the compensation structure explained in full before I agree to anything." The response came quickly. "Of course," he wrote. "I'd expect nothing less." She put her phone away and kept walking, and the columns in her head, for the first time in a very long time, felt like they might actually balance.